So, tonight's Hebrew word for your learning, for your edification, is teruah. Anyone knows what the word teruah means? Teruah? A shout. It's the sound of the trumpet. But the word teruah means a shout or a blast. Sometimes it's referred to as a battle cry, the teruah. That word was used tonight in the Torah portion from what Laura read for us, the sound of the shofar, blowing the shofar on the 10th day of the 7th month. It's a teruah. It's a blast, a shout, battle cry. All right, so the 3 points of interest tonight would be the land Shabbats, which we'll look at first, the land Shabbats. That's relating to the Shabbats that are relative to the land, the actual physical land. God ordained that the land should have Shabbats. We're going to look at the second point, which is the Jubilee, the year of release or the year of liberty, the year of release. The third point will be maintaining being or maintaining the being of being a holy nation, a nation. The word is Kadash. How did I phrase it? Yep. Maintenance of an Am Kadash. We looked at the word Kadash about 3 weeks ago. It is the Hebrew word for consecrate or consecrated. So maintenance of an Am Kadash, or a people set apart. So those are the 3 points of interest. Let's begin with the land Shabbats. We find this in Leviticus chapter 25, tonight's Torah portion, 1 to 7, which I'll read for you. And we'll read about how relevant the land is in regards to God's purpose. The land has to be given Shabbats, so naturally the land is relevant. God sees the land of Israel, that is, as his land, uniquely belonging to him. You say that, well, all lands belong to God. That's certainly true. But he refers to the land of Israel specifically as his land. And we'll see that when we study through this first point, the land Shabbat. So let's read in chapter 25, Leviticus 1 to 7. The Lord then spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai. That's where the Torah portion, the name of the Torah portion comes from, Behar, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Shabbat to the Lord. So that's a land Shabbat, right? When you come in, he's referring to the time when they would come into the land of Israel. The first order of business is to give the land a Shabbat. Stop and think about that. The land of Israel, that's Canaan, right? That's the land of Canaan. Effectively, since the Canaanites were there, the land never had a Shabbat. So their first order of business as they come in is to give the land a Shabbat. Makes sense, doesn't it? So that was their first order of priority, to give the land a Shabbat. And then it goes on, 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyards and gather its crops. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Shabbat rest, a Shabbat to the Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest aftergrowth you shall not keep. And your grapes and untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year. So it's the Shabbat year. Every 7 years, the land gets a rest. And during those 7 years, you're not to harvest anything. Even the crops that come up untimely by itself, you're not to harvest it. All of you shall have a Shabbat, shall have the Shabbat products of the land for food, yourselves and your males and female slaves, your hired men and your foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you. Even your cattle and the animals that are in your land shall have all of its crops, shall have all its crops to eat. So the accumulation of whatever crops you have at the end of the 6th year is what will be eaten during the Shabbat year. You give the land a complete rest, right? So I think last year we gave our little garden out here a Shabbat rest. So that's based on 6 years of produce, 6 years of working our little portion out here and giving it a rest on the 7th. It is entirely biblical. It is what God wanted from the people of Israel. So the land Shabbats are important, right? Certainly they're important. God ordained that they should happen. What happened with Israel as they came into the land? They were not entirely faithful with this. They didn't actually keep the land Shabbats the way that they should have. And what was the result of it? We'll see it in next week's Torah portion, but we'll read a little bit of it here in a few moments. So God wanted Israel, first order of priority, give the land its rest as you come in immediately. And then you follow subsequently with a 7th-year Shabbat every following 7 years. And this was to be perpetual, ongoing. Israel failed to fulfill that. Ultimately, it resulted in a calamity. And the calamity was God would drive his people into the diaspora. Not only because they didn't keep the land Shabbats, but that was certainly a part of it. Now, let's read about what happened subsequently as Israel did not observe the land Shabbats. In chapter 26, we're going to read into next week's Torah portion a little bit. By the way, tonight's Torah portion is Leviticus 25 to 26, chapter 2. So here in Leviticus chapter 26 now, we're going to see what happens as Israel fails to keep the land Shabbats. We're going to read in chapter 26, 34 and 35. A little backdrop on what I'm about to tell you and what we're about to read. Israel failed in basically every way to be the people of God. Just about. In every sense they failed. God wanted Israel to be an Am Segula, a holy people, an Am Kadash, a people sanctified. They didn't obey him. They didn't follow through. And he warned them in Leviticus chapter 26, right at Mount Sinai, literally in this same message of tonight's Torah portion, Leviticus chapter 26, he tells Israel clearly, if you obey my commands, and he listed 3 things that we'll talk about in a few moments from Leviticus chapter 26, verse 1 and 2. Those 3 things were, you keep my Shabbats, you sanctify keep my sanctuary clean, pure, sanctified, and you avoid, you refrain, you stay away from idolatry. Those are the 3 things he wanted Israel to primary with. So those are the 3 primaries. Don't engage in idolatry, keep his sanctuary sanctified, and observe the Shabbats. Israel failed in those 3 areas. And God said to Israel at Mount Sinai that should you do such a thing, there would be ramifications. But before he went to the ramifications, he made sure that Moses, on behalf of himself, communicated to Israel what would happen, what will be the effects of their obedience. And we'll see next week in the Torah portion that the effects of their obedience would be blessings, reward. God's goodness and his favor would rest upon the people of Israel should they obey him and carry out his will. But then he goes on to talk about what would happen if they should not. And Leviticus chapter 26 is very vivid in that regard. Effectively, what will happen to Israel is they would experience 4 types of judgments before the 5th type of judgment. Next week we'll look at that. So the last judgment that they would receive from God for their unwillingness to obey him is diaspora. God will drive them into the nations, and that's the final step in his correction and his punishment to Israel should they not obey him. So diaspora, all right? So that's where we are right now. Leviticus chapter 26, verse 33 is when he said that he will drive Israel out into the nations. So now we're going to read 34 and 35 as it relates to the land and the Sabbaths that God has determined for the land. Verse 34 and 35. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths. Following what? Following the diaspora. Israel being driven out into the diaspora. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation. While you are in your enemy's land, then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. I want you to think about how important the Sabbaths are and how important the land is. Right? He's given the land its Sabbaths, the Sabbaths that Israel did not give to it. All the days of its desolation I will observe the rest. I will observe the rest which it did not observe on your Shabbats while you were living on it. So God's going to give the land the Shabbats that were owed it. He's going to give it, and more. I always say it's interesting that following this statement at Mount Sinai, shortly thereafter, Israel entered into the land, and for a period of roughly 1,500 years, Israel denied the land its Sabbaths, more or less. And God would then drive them out into the nations for roughly 1,500 years. The restoration process began in earnest about 500 years ago when the Jews of Spain and Portugal and other areas in North Africa and so on began to return to the land of Israel. And as they became a nation in 1948, Israel has been very careful to keep the Shabbats, the land Shabbats. They're very, very careful about it, very deliberate in keeping the land Shabbats. Effectively, the 2,000 years or 2,500 years of diaspora has taught them concerning the land Shabbats, that they're important, that they're relevant. So God did this incredible thing and gave the land its Shabbats, the Shabbats that they themselves didn't give to it. Also in same chapter, we're going to read 40 to 40 what do I have here? 40 to 42, concerning the Shabbats that was denied the land. He says, if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their forefathers in their unfaithfulness which they committed against me, and I also in their acting with hostility against me, I also was acting with hostility against them to bring them into the land of their enemies. Or if their uncircumcised heart becomes humble so that they would make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember my covenant with Isaac, and I will remember my covenant with Abraham as well, and I will remember the land. So again, mentioned there, his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is his covenant with the land. As if the land is a living organism. As if the land is a person. He's going to remember the land and give favor to the land. The prophets all talk about this time. Hosea talks about the time when the people of Israel will return to the land, and the land will blossom in preparation for its people. Ezekiel chapter 36, very vivid, chapter 36, talks about the land blossoming in preparation to receive the people of Israel. So this is what God is talking about. So the land Shabbats were very important for Israel. They pointed to God's incredible love and his commitment to the very land of Israel. Israel failed in giving it its Shabbats, and that's a terrible story, a terrible outcome. God loves the land. Also in the same Torah portion, chapter 25, we see a statement here in regards to the land, verse 23. Speaking, he says, the land, moreover, shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. For you are but aliens and sojourners with me. So that's a pretty definitive statement. The land is mine. You are but sojourners and visitors, aliens to the land. So God loves that land. In Deuteronomy also, it's very clear the land has a special place in God's heart. So do we find that a little odd that God would have, the God of the Bible would have a special place in his heart for the land, the literal land, the terrain, the actual terrain of the land of Israel? It's different. It's a different Christianity than what we're used to. Right? But we're being biblical, so it's okay to stand on what we're seeing here. It's okay to proclaim this and to believe this, because the Bible clearly states it. God says, that land is my land. Why did he not choose Utah? It's a more attractive land. It's more attractive terrain. Why did he not choose, the foothills of the Himalayas? That's pretty attractive. sprawling hills, green, prairies and wonderful folding hills with ice caps. The Himalayas, wonderful. Why did he not choose something, a place like that? But he chose a land that's not necessarily attractive, a difficult land. Why did he choose such a land? In Deuteronomy, let's jump over to Deuteronomy. Concerning the land, see if I can find the reference here. Yeah, it's going to be a challenge. The land is a land, it says in Deuteronomy, and I can't find it right now, that sucks the water from heaven, that takes the water from heaven. It couldn't be that relevant. I can't find it. Doesn't matter. So the land, right? So God wanted Israel to be caretakers of the land, and in being caretakers of the land, they would give the land its Shabbats. They didn't, and there was a ramification, which was Israel being driven out. Let's look at the second point of interest. We'll indirectly come back to that first point again. So the Jubilee. 11? Is it? Sounds good. Sounds good enough for me. Deuteronomy 11. Let's see if that's right. Yeah. So I'm going to read 8 to 12 for us in Deuteronomy 11. Let's just, concerning God's love for the land and what the land of Israel means to God. You shall therefore keep, verse 8, you shall therefore keep every commandment which I am commanding you today, so that you may be strong and go in and possess the land which you are about to cross over to possess it, so that you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord your God swore to your fathers to give it to them and their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land in which you are entering to possess it, it is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. In other words, it's not an incredibly fertile land. The soil is not like it is in the delta of the Nile, where you can use your feet to sow. You can basically plant seeds with your toes. It's not like that land. It's difficult. It's hard. It's difficult to work. But the land in which you are about to cross to possess it, a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven. A land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning even to the end of the year. So the land is special to God. God's eyes are always on that land. It's a land for which he cares. It is a difficult land. It's not an easy land to work. And the things of God are usually like that. God does not necessarily give you a land where you can sow with your feet, where you can plant your seeds with your toes. No, the things that God will, the land, let's say allegorically speaking, the land that he will give to us is a land that we have to till and sow and labor for. We have to endeavor, and by our sweat equity, we will produce. And that's the land of Israel. So the things of the kingdom, and just to capture it and move on, the things of the kingdom are usually difficult to attain to, difficult to arrive at. But it is the way of God that we should struggle for these things. If everything we receive in regards to the kingdom of God was easily attained, where would be our endurance? Where would be our faith? Right? So we have the faith, we have the endurance to persevere through the difficult land and to endeavor through a difficult land to produce in. And that's what the land of Israel is. And God forewarned Israel about it. Now, the Shabbats would have been beneficial for them. It would have made the land that much more cultivatable, right? If they kept the Shabbats. God would have been with them in that whole process, but they didn't. And because of that, we see many episodes of famine and droughts and difficulty in the land of Israel because they didn't give the land its Shabbats And worse than that, they filled the land with idolatry and unrighteousness. Let's talk about the Jubilee. All right, so the Jubilee now, what is the Jubilee? You give the land a rest every 7 years. But every 7 of 7 years, you have a special year. That's the 49th year. So you have 7 sevens, 7 Shabbats of years, and then you have the year of Jubilee. So the 50th year would be the year of Jubilee. So the year of Jubilee is a time of what I call the time of release. A time when you will issue liberty and freedom. And we'll have to talk about that. So let's talk about the Jubilee, the time of release. Leviticus chapter 25, same chapter. I'm going to read 8 to 12, the Jubilee. You are also to count off 7 Shabbats of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Shabbats of years, namely the 49th year. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound a horn all through your land. Now that word sound there is teruah, right? To sound, to make a blast, and that's on Yom Kippur. But it's speaking of Jubilee. So in the year of Jubilee, on the 10th day of the 7th month of that year, you sound the shofar throughout the land. So, strictly speaking, everywhere in the land of Israel, in the year of Jubilee, the 10th day of the 7th month, there should be shofars blasting throughout the land, right? You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you return to his family. You shall have a 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow, not reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines. In other words, he's saying there, even during that year, even if your vines continue to produce, you refrain from picking its produce. Even if your ears of corn continues to your field where there are ears of corn left begins to produce, you don't harvest it during that year, you leave it, right? So that's what the Jubilee or the Shabbat year is about. For it is a Jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall not eat its crops out of the field. It's a year of release, a year of liberty. Proclaiming liberty. Release to whom? Or liberty to whom? The poor, those who live, who are not well-to-do, in other words, who live a life beholden to others. They are servants, they are workers in the field that belong to someone else. They are not wealthy. The Torah portion talks all about that in chapter 25. These people that work for you as, dare I say it, slaves, they are to be released. If someone owes you money on that Jubilee year, you write it off completely. If there is any kind of a business deal that includes beholdenment, it's released. It is the year of release. Now, isn't that something? God's system for community living involves the Jubilee, where you would effectively forget the debts that you are owed and release your servants. I believe that the servants had the will or had the option to go back and continue to live with their masters, but they were released. And for that year, they were allowed to go to their families and go to their hometowns and just be set free. So think about that. That's God's system. Of course, this involves economics, right? It's about releasing debts. It's about setting people free. So God's system of economics, to say that it's fair just doesn't suffice. It is beneficial to the overall well-being of the community that such a thing would happen. What would happen if every 49 years, at the end of every 49 years, such a thing would happen in our community? every person would experience at least 1 year of a jubilee, right? Every person should. Now, not exactly every person would, but every person who lived to an average age of maybe 75 years or 72 to 75 years would experience a jubilee, a time of release. What would that do for a community at large, in general? What would that do to a community? Think of the social effect of such a thing. How will that affect a given community? If the entire country, this country, had such a law in place that we were biblical to the point of observing and celebrating God's Jubilee year, what would that do to our country? It will enrich our country in many ways. First of all, we would have God's blessings for sure because we would be observing the Shabbats. If we celebrate a Jubilee, it would mean that we celebrated the land Shabbats, that every year we gave the land a rest. You can't celebrate the Jubilee year and not celebrate the Shabbat, the annual Shabbats, right? You have to celebrate the annual Shabbats 7 times to come to the Jubilee. So if our community, and we do that here, I'm not sure if we've ever celebrated a Jubilee year, but we've celebrated here for a while the annual Shabbats, and we know the blessings from it. We understand how God blesses as a result of our obedience to it. But as a nation, what would it be like if this nation were to carry out such a thing? It would be incredible. It would be blessings unlike anything we've ever experienced. Now, this is what Israel is doing today. They've been doing it since 1948. They had one Jubilee, which I think they celebrated in 1999, I think it was. They celebrated a Jubilee year. So since 1948, they had seven sevens of years. And in all those years, they celebrated the annual, the 7-year Shabbat. And in 1999, they had their Jubilee. So when will they have another Jubilee? 50 years following 1999. At some point, they'll have another Jubilee. So Israel is reaping the benefits of observing the land Shabbats. How prosperous is the nation of Israel should the nations back away from Israel and allow Israel to be the commercial entity, the economic entity that God has designed her to be? How prosperous would Israel be? One of the objectives of the nations is to hold back Israel, to suppress Israel, BDS, and all of the rest that we know about. All of those efforts are efforts that are designed to hold Israel back in prosperity. Israel is prospering as a nation. As long as she's free and continues to be free, observing Torah in the way that she does, she will prosper. Now, in the meantime, what about the nations? Does the nations have anything like a Jubilee? Well, that's yeah. Well, that's far from a Jubilee, right? That's nothing like a Jubilee. So the nations, in their system of economics, there's no such thing as a release. No, you are indebted, you are in bondage, and the best that they can do is put you in more bondage. So Micah just talked about the reset. The reset on the surface might sound like a good thing, and they will certainly try to project it as a good thing. But it never can be a good thing because you're going from bondage to bondage. The nations offer nothing like a Jubilee. They are incapable of offering anything that brings life and hope. So their economic system, in contrast to God's system, brings bondage, destruction, totalitarianism, which is what's coming. If a financial reset were to occur, do you honestly think that the people of the world would benefit from it? Did you say probably? It's robbery. It's highway robbery. So think about it. Venezuela. 15 years ago, let's say 15 years, no, 25 years ago, before the People's Revolution in Venezuela, Venezuela was the 4th richest country in the world. The richest Latin American country in the world. Venezuela was extremely prosperous. This is something that most people don't know. Venezuela was the zenith of the Latin world, even way beyond Spain and any of those other countries. And what happened? Inflation. Inflation happened. Bad leadership. And inflation took Venezuela by the throat. Before long, the middle class vanished. A little while after, the upper classes began to be impoverished because of inflation. And before long, the people stood up and said, we're not going to take this anymore. And that gave us a dictator. What was his name? Hugo Chavez. Gave us Hugo Chavez. And now, think of Venezuela. Venezuela has eaten all their zoo animals. There's not a zoo anywhere in Caracas. Venezuela exists in abject horror and poverty because of their economic system and because of their communism, of course. So what this world system has in store for us is exactly what Venezuela has experienced. In other words, we can look at Venezuela and see Venezuela as a microcosm of what these economic giants, these economic juggernauts have in store for us. And that's the best man will offer. Man cannot come up with anything redeemable other than that. So man will give you bondage, hopelessness, abject, sorrow, whereas God gives you liberty and he provides a release. So in the age to come, I venture to say that there would be jubilees to celebrate in the millennial kingdom. We will celebrate the annual Shabbats and the 7 annual Shabbat as well, the year of Jubilee, the year of release. So the nations gives us bondage, abject misery, whereas God gives us a release. So that's what the Jubilee is all about. Let's talk about the third point of interest as it relates to maintaining, or the maintenance of an Am Kadash, people consecrated, a people set apart. So Israel was called by God to be a people set apart, a holy people, right? A consecrated people. In tonight's Torah portion, he gave Israel, in just 2 verses, the basis by which they can maintain that holiness, that being of being set apart. Let's read here in chapter 26, the last 2 verses of tonight's Torah portion, 1 and 2. You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar. What's a sacred pillar? A Baal. It's a phallic symbol. It's a horrid abomination before God. So you shall not set up for yourself an image or a sacred pillar. You shall not place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Shabbats and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. So those are 3 things that God wants Israel to do, and this is just to maintain their position as a holy nation. Israel had the entire law to be responsible for, 613 laws, statutes, and commandments. They were to love the Lord their God with their heart, their soul, and their mind, and to serve him from that place. And if they did, they would not infringe upon the 3 things that God says that they should not do: defile his sanctuary, worship idols, and violate his Shabbats. Well, Israel, the nation of Israel, does in fact violate his Shabbats. They desanctify they profane his sanctuary, and they did worship the Baals and the Ishtaras and the Molechs. Now, this is the horrible history of Israel. That even after God forewarned them and outlined for them exactly what will happen, next week we will look at that Israel still continued in their unrighteousness. All God wanted from Israel, for them to maintain that position of being a people set apart, a holy nation, was simple obedience. These 3 things wasn't difficult for them as a nation to stay away from. How difficult is it as as a nation or leadership in that nation to refrain from worshiping idols. How difficult is it to maintain the Shabbat? How difficult is it to not profane his sanctuary? Seems like this is an easy charge. Three very easy things to accomplish or to avoid. But Israel fell right into it. Now, there is clear evidence there that the devil, the enemy, God's enemy, Hasatan, was directly involved in it. And he certainly was. He used a righteous, who was initially a righteous king, to compromise Israel. We're talking about Solomon. Solomon was initially a righteous king. He saw his inadequacies. He called out to God. He prayed for wisdom. He prayed for God's intervention. He received it. And then he went right into bringing the worst kinds of idolatry into the land of Israel. So it really, really began with Solomon. We saw idolatry before in Israel, but it really kicked off in a really strong way with Solomon. So once Solomon allowed idolatry to come into the land, from that point forward, it was sort of a losing battle. Because of Solomon's sin, we have the division of the kingdom, north and south. The northern kingdom never, ever, at any time in their existence, obeyed God. Never. Throughout their time, which was roughly 700 years, 600 years, never once were they pleasing to God. They continued to worship the Baal and the Ashtoreth. All of it because of Solomon's sin. And what was Solomon's sin? We can identify many sins of Solomon, but Solomon's sin, I'm saying plural, Solomon's sin, one, truly his only sin, was he was unable to trust God and unable to really rely upon God's power and God's strength and God's help to establish his kingdom. In his own strength, he determined to establish his kingdom through marriage, through alliances with foreign kingdoms. He determined that that's how he would make his kingdom strong, and he failed. He failed, and because of that failure, we see incredible sin following throughout the existence of the nation of Israel, to the point where ultimately God would have to drive the people of Israel out. All God wanted was simple obedience. It's not much, obedience. After Solomon, there were kings in Judah who attempted to do the right thing, and they succeeded for a while, but then another king will come, and he would fail and draw Judah and Israel into sin and idolatry again. So how does that apply to us? Well, any of the points of interest tonight, how do they apply to us? The land Shabbats. Does the land Shabbats apply to us? Yeah. If we observe the weekly Shabbat, we should observe the land Shabbats. And then what about the Jubilee? Yes. If we observe the weekly Shabbats and the land Shabbats, we should observe the Shabbat of Shabbats, of annual Shabbats, which is the Jubilee. So that applies to us. What about the Jubilee? We talked about that. What about now this last point of interest that involves the maintenance of being a holy people? How does that apply to us? This will preach for at least an hour, so I'm not going to go too far with this. Israel was called and appointed by God to be an armed Kadash, an armed Segula as well, a peculiar people, a people set apart, but an armed Kadash, a people consecrated. And in doing this, they would have been a vessel for God's glory. God would have been glorified in everything that Israel would have done had they committed themselves to consecration to God. And that's what God wanted. He didn't want the people of Israel to defame him. Right? He didn't want them to take glory away from himself and undermine themselves, their own testimony. So he wanted them to be obedient. For their own sake and for his glory, they didn't. And he drove them out into the nations. Later on, next week, in fact, we will see that God said, it is because of my covenant. In fact, we read it. It's because of my covenant that I will bring you back and reestablish you in the land. Next week, we will look at Ezekiel chapter 37, how it relates to that. And God says very clearly, you defiled my name among the nations, in that you were driven out into the nations. The very fact that Israel existed in the nations meant that they did not obey him, did not glorify him with obedience. All we ever need in our relationship with God comes down to obedience. It always does. Obedience is so integral as it relates to our faith experience, our faith walk. Without obedience, you don't have a faith experience. Without a faith experience, you don't attain to righteousness. So obedience is fundamental. It is the basis of our relationship with God. You cannot have any credible relationship with God if you're not obeying God. So this last point of interest as it relates to maintaining ourselves as an arm Kadash is very important for us. We have to maintain holiness before God. Holiness is not just something we do externally. It is, or obedience that leads to righteousness, does not only occur on the external things we do, it also exists on the level of our thoughts, on the inside. The way we process our thinking about each other, about our family, about people in general, things that are relevant to God. All of these things, the way we internally approach these things are very important as it relates to our holiness. The reality of us being a people set apart. Our actions must be weighed before God. I'm not saying that we have to, be super concerned about every little thing we do. No. OCD about our faith, no. But we have to be careful and deliberate about seeking God's face about everything we do, every action, and even every thought. The Bible says to submit all of your thoughts to Jesus' authority. And that's important in being this people, a holy consecrated people. Jesus speaking the night before the cross in John's Gospel, he spoke about obedience. Let's go to John chapter 14. In John chapter 14, I'm going to read for you what Jesus said in 13 and in 15 and in 23. Jesus speaking to his disciples, might as well be speaking to me and you. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. You'll keep my word. Israel didn't, because of their lack of commitment. And really, actually, because of Solomon's sin, Israel failed, couldn't obey God. Verse 23, Jesus answered and said to them, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. Now that verse 23 is really a wonderful verse. Let's read it again. Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. Obedience to God's word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. So the Holy One of Israel and the Son, Jesus, will have their abode, will live with you, will abide with you if you obey. Conversely, if you do not obey, you don't have their dwelling with you. Is that fair to deduce? If obedience puts us in a place where they live with us, they abide with us, then a lack of obedience means that they will not abide with us. Seems to reason. God is merciful. He is. But we must understand that what's necessary, what he wants from us, is obedience. First of all, let me say, to obey him, you have to know what his will is for your life. You have to be pursuant of it. You have to discover it. You have to accept it by faith that this is God's will for my life. And once you have it, you hold it and you walk in it. You will attain to what's called righteousness. It's the only way for us to attain to righteousness and to maintain our position before God as a person or a people consecrated. Not difficult, by no means complicated, very simple, 3 very simple points. The most important thing that I want us to take away from this is that God expects us to obey him. And so you must have, first of all, his will for your life. You know his will, you have his word, you know what's expected of you from his word, but what about in your personal life? What has God given you? What has God called you to do? What does God expect from you? Only you can determine what that is. Only you, by your own faith and by your own precedent to God, can know and determine what God's will is for your life. And if you know it, do not turn away from it. Obey God. Fulfill that purpose. Trust him in doing so. God's able to equip you to satisfy his will for your life. Shabbat Shalom.